Hello everyone, Baldur's Gate 3 has been out for a while now, so I figured it's about time we talk about the later parts of the game, namely Act 3 and also the endings. In the first part of the video I will do my best to avoid any major spoilers, but still, if you haven't reached the later parts of Act 3, it's best to come back to this video once you are close to finishing the game, unless you don't mind talking about some plot points, and in the second part of the video we will talk about the endings itself, so be aware of that. Before we begin and I start commenting on stuff that might upset some, I just want to say I absolutely loved Baldur's Gate 3 as a whole, and it is most definitely my game of the year so far. So any qualms you might hear do not change that. I just want to summarize issues some people voiced already towards the last part of the game, and also my own opinion on it. I hope we can have a healthy conversation about it in the comments and let me know what you think yourself after the video. So let's begin with entering Act 3. The act begins in Rivington, which is an enjoyable prequel to the actual city with some great parts like the circus, Shara's Caress, and some cool side areas like the coast that I really liked, and the beginning of the murder mystery, which was pretty good, but I must admit that there were some signs of the drop in quality here already, with some of the areas feeling a bit bland comparing to Act 1 and 2. In Act 1 you can feel the polish on every corner of the map and how it really benefited from such a long early access period. Act 1 is pretty much the perfect gaming experience, and I think that is what most people judge Baldur's Gate 3 on before they reach the later acts, especially with calling it a flawless game. Then we get to Act 2, which I absolutely loved the atmosphere of, but it did start to show some chinks here and there already. My biggest gripe being that the map itself could feel bland at times, with large tracks of no enemies or interactions for extended period of traversing the Shadowlands, but it was still a very enjoyable experience with perhaps the most satisfying conclusion and also one of the best fights in the game. Overall, a great experience with memorable quests, characters and plotlines and dungeons, and that's why arriving in Act 3 might feel a bit bland after such a unique area at first. Act 1 was a nearly perfect introduction to the adventure, and Act 2 was unique and also had some great side plots like the Githyanki crash and the Sharan temple, lifting the Shadow Curse of course, and concluding with a finale of fighting an avatar of the God of Death, after which you arrive at just that, a city with mainly earthly problems. Of course, there are some great side quests here which I will mention later, but I admit I had to overcome my own personal dislike of huge cities in RPGs, but that will not influence my opinion on Act 3. Obviously, the game being called Baldur's Gate, we knew the city will be huge and brimming with life, and we will spend a good portion of the game in it. I have to say that among all the RPGs I played over the decades, the city of Baldur's Gate was still one of the more enjoyable ones. I enjoyed spending my time in it, but it can be overwhelming and underwhelming at the same time when you start doing basic fetch quests and a lot of NPCs have barely any dialogue. Also, some of your companions grow noticeably more quiet, at least from my experience, except for the ones with still unresolved quest lines like Will, Astarion or Shadowheart. But Halsin and Mintara, for example, were a late addition to the cast and it definitely shows. There is still some amazing content here of course. I liked Sorcerer's Sundries and epic quests like The Legend of Ansur, or perhaps my favorite House of Hope, with an amazing fight and perhaps an even better musical number. Those were definitely my highlights of Act 3. I also somewhat enjoyed the Iron Throne minigame but hated the Steel Factory. Also, if you were playing as the Darkerage, the Ballspawn plot was pretty satisfying. But when it comes to villains of the act, comparing to Ketheric Torm, both Gortash and Orin fall a bit flat and feel one-dimensional. Gortash was charismatic and cool at first, but then proceeds to do almost nothing for the entire act. I think he should be more involved throughout the game, especially politically, as that was kind of his thing. And the fight with him itself was perhaps the most underwhelming of the entire game. And yes, I know you can make it tougher if you don't disable the Steel Watch, but the whole point of the quest is to do it. I also understand the decision to make the fight underwhelming on purpose somewhat, as among the cast of demigods he is just a normal human in the end, with no special powers, with influence and deception being his main portfolio, but the fight still could have been way more interesting with some usages of his technology and resources, and instead he died in 2 rounds on my tactician difficulty playthrough. The fact that he doesn't do fuck all after you encounter him the first time and just awaits his death in his tower, while you can do whatever you want in the city for hours, was disappointing. After how hyped he was in the trailers, I have hoped he will show up more predominantly, maybe not on the level of Orin, but still show his influence on the city way more often. Speaking of Orin, she was alright, especially if you're playing as the Darkerage, but the fight itself, at least for me in the duel of the Ballspawn, ended even more quicker than the Gortash fight, as I smited her to Kingdom Come and she didn't even use any interesting skills at all. But I have heard the fight is apparently better while not playing as the Darkerage and not having a duel but instead a full-on fight. Overall, I enjoyed the Darkerage plot. However, towards the end I was starting to grow a bit exhausted of the Ballspawn saga, and while I understand the whole thing was a love letter to previous Baldur's Gate titles, I wished it had a cooler, less predictable twist. If it wasn't for the purpose of reviews, I would have probably finished my first playthrough as a normal custom character and make my second playthrough as Dark Urge to increase replayability, but instead I went the opposite route, and now I'm playing as a custom Githyanki character without the Dark Urge, which actually I am so far impressed with reactivity towards it. Without the ball spawn plot, it feels surprisingly even more organic. When it comes to the main villains of the game, excluding of course the main big baddie that we will talk about later, I find it unfortunate that Katurik Torm was the first major villain to go, as I feel he was both the most menacing and interesting character of the three. He just had the unfortunate luck of being the first major boss of the game, which was a tough act to follow for Oren and Gortash. Not to mention the avatar of Myrkul was amazing and visually awesome. I had hoped we will face Bane's avatar as well instead of a meek human surrounded by guards, and Oren's Slayer form will be more impressive. But alright, I hope I'm not starting to sound like I hated Act 3 as a whole, because it was far from it. As I said, some of my favorite quests lie on this act. It's just that sitting so much in one huge location on the map gets exhausting after a while, and I wish it was split more like with the Underdark in Act 1 and Mountain Pass. I was surprised we didn't even get to see the upper city at all, and the Undercity felt like a chore to get through sometimes, not even half as exciting as the Underdark. I must admit that the closer I got to the end, the more I felt like I just wanted to finish the side quest as soon as possible, which I find is never a good sign for an RPG when I start getting this creeping feeling of just wanting to go to the finish line. Having said that, I can tell there was a lot of love and hard work put into the city. It is absolutely humongous and filled with content on almost every corner. Even if some of it was simpler, I still admire how much ambition was put into it. But I cannot emphasize it enough that comparing to Act 1 and 2, Act 3 can just feel a bit too normal for the lack of a better word, except some side areas like the House of Hope and under the prison of Worm's Rock. But those side areas lived in their own bubble outside of the city, and perhaps that's why they simply feel better to me. Solving the murder plotline was fine. I loved the circus, I loved some parts leading up to the entire city, I liked the underground smuggling network with 9 fingers, even recruiting Minsk was pretty enjoyable. I thought he's gonna be more annoying to be honest, and shoehorned a little bit, but his constant reminder to the player of Boo was a bit too fanservicey for my taste. However, I still enjoyed Minsk and Jaheira's inclusion for the most part, and took them with me on many quests where I thought they were reminiscent old times, and they did so, which felt satisfying. Some returning characters in the city were also a welcomed sight. Still, if there was one sentence I could describe Act 3 as, it would be this: lack of polish. And I don't mean me or my country of origin here. The city itself suffers from what was Larian's Achilles heel many times before, which I think was running out of time to make sure the last parts will be fleshed out as much as the first 2/3 of the game. There is definitely the biggest number of bugs here as well. Some minor and some almost game breaking. That's why I'm glad I had 25 quick save slots, because I sure needed some of them. Bugs ranging from characters not moving when they should, in the Iron Throne for example, and even towards the end of the game one of my companions simply refused to follow me despite being attached to the party and not being encumbered. FPS drops were common even on my decent PC, some items just disappeared, NPCs bugged and ragdolls could stretch and fly anywhere at times, which while hilarious wasn't very welcomed. Also, what's up with there being a shop called the Literal Facemaker in the city but not being able to change your appearance? It's another clear sign for me that some things were cut from the game. What I can't understand and excuse however is inventory management in camp, which just drove me nuts at times. Why can't you see all your gear in camp from all of your companions and your chest? Boggles my mind, and it is extremely tedious having to check every companion and your stash, and only having your traveler's chest that doesn't expand beyond a certain size, and the sorting is mediocre to say the least. Probably 20 hours of the 150 that I had on my first playthrough trying to figure out what is where. Yes, I know there is sorting, but still gear management in camp was just awful for me. The only redeeming factor is being able to swap gear slots among your companions, but still it's only among your active ones for some weird reason and not all of them. But I know there is the first major patch in the works, so I hope some of those issues will be fixed, and I'm sure Larian is working on it, so some of my complaints here will be fixed over time. But that is just the thing here, time. I think Act 3 would have benefited greatly from a couple more months in the cooker, but as it stands, I think it isn't controversial to call Act 3 the weakest of the three, bar some side areas and subquests, but sadly still don't redeem the act as a whole. But I have to say that being the weakest act does not mean that it was bad. I still had more fun in the city of Baldur's Gate than I did while playing whole entire games in past years. Perhaps only Elden Ring coming close to the feeling this game gave me. So I was definitely still addicted to exploring it, but the lack of polish, the amount of bugs, and some blandness of it all, comparing to the epicness of previous acts, definitely started to show. Oh, and one last thing before we move to the endgame, I have to talk about the level cap. Larian said that they didn't want to go beyond level 12 because of the power level it would entice would be too powerful for the setting. But at the same time, we are dealing with godlike epic enemies, especially towards the end of the game, that should be realistically tackled only by epic level characters. So other than from a mechanical standpoint, I really don't understand the decision. I feel the game could have easily went on to level 14 and beyond, and no one would complain about the power curve. You are already wielding close to demigod powers, especially if you use your illeted ones, which the consequences of, or rather lack thereof, we will talk about soon. The fact that I was getting massive amounts of XP that didn't amount to anything in the end, as I was already level capped from less than halfway in the act, was a bit of a letdown. Seeing all the XP going to waste, it makes me hard to believe that the level cap wasn't originally intended higher, because there is easily experience in the game for level 14 and beyond, and the story itself does not feel like a level 12 campaign. It is way too grand for such relatively low level characters, so it felt a bit disjointed dealing with gods and elder brains on this character level. But don't get me wrong, I know that D&D campaigns that go beyond level 10 can be a menace to manage, so I somewhat understand the decision, but given the scope of the story, I just wish we had even more to tinker our builds with. Some spells and abilities could be simply nerfed to allow us to go a couple levels further, but I suppose mods will address that in time. However, that would trivialize a lot of encounters in the game, so unless a higher difficulty mod will be released alongside it, it might not mesh well together. However, we are here to talk about the base game as it is. I admit I am really hoping for some major patches, and I would love a DLC or even an expansion down the line, because in the end I still loved the experience and I don't want to leave this amazing game after only one campaign. Even though I will be replaying the game countless times, I simply crave more already. Any critique I'm giving it right now comes from my pure passion and love towards the genre, and the amazing experience that Larian has crafted. I adore Baldur's Gate 3 despite my gripes, and again I just hope that after arcs Larian learned their lesson and will stick to the landing. Speaking of the landing, let us tackle perhaps the biggest complaints from people that has finished the game, which is the end game and the endings itself. So if you didn't finish the game yet and don't want to be majorly spoiled, you better turn around now. Otherwise, buckle your seatbelts and get ready for a rant. Major spoilers begin now, you have been warned. My biggest complaint by far about the last 2-3 hours of the game is the lack of feeling that your decisions mattered. The biggest culprit here is the tadpoles. I was sure, convinced even, that avoiding using any tadpole powers and not mind influencing people, refusing Emperor's deal and not using it on your companions will have some implication. Or at the very least a mention that I persist throughout the entire game without giving in, and how does the game reward me? By making me choose to either become a mind flayer or dooming Orpheus to the same fate. Or the awkward choice of letting Karlach become one, which we will speak on later because how her plot resolved grind my gears in itself. So my decision on not using the tadpoles had no impact on the story at all. All I did was rob myself of extra power and content that didn't matter in the end. No matter what you do, you are stuck between a rock and a hard place, letting the manipulative emperor get his way, robbing the gift of their prince, or becoming a monstrosity yourself, no matter your decisions during the game. And then there is this weird decision of the emperor to just go back to the Netherbrain if you don't agree to his terms. Excuse me, what? After he did literally everything the entire game to rebel against it, he just fucks off to be a cuck slave again. Yes, I know that the Absolute said she was anticipating our every move and let the emperor lose on purpose, but I still find it poor writing to just make the emperor with all his ambitions surrender in a split second like that. Especially since there was no reason at all for him to suck on Orpheus. The emperor was a mind flayer already, so all he had to do was agree to spare Orpheus, but nah, rather than trying his luck and siding with us, he chose literal mind suicide. Speaking of choices that don't matter, when it comes to side quests during the game, I did almost everything there was to be done in Act 3, and all I got for completing every companion quest and almost all faction side quests was a button to summon some cannon fodder in the final fight, but at least the owlbear was cute. There was no real resolution, no ending slides, no acknowledgement of all we did throughout the game. The last fight itself was alright, although the road to it was god-awful in my opinion. I didn't feel such excruciating pain of getting through an area anywhere else in the game. And now we arrive at the ending itself. Let's start with the positives. Lae'zel's resolution has been probably the best, especially if you spare Orpheus, but all the endings that I saw with Lae'zel felt pretty good and I liked it. And then the next best resolution was, let's see, okay, it all went downhill from here. So the Githyanki plot was the most satisfying, I will give them that. But after that, some companions get a line or two, some didn't appear at all, Astarion is reduced to comic relief, and that's after I saved him with a very satisfying conclusion from the Cazador plotline. He just starts burning, which was expected of course after the tadpole was removed, but still, him running off like that and just Gale or someone commenting or remarking that we probably won't see him ever again? Excuse me, what? He was my bro through the whole game with maxed attitude, and that's how they treat me completing his every quest and side quest, he just fucks off. Speaking about Elminster 2.0, or should I say Gale, who I even romanced, had all but 2 lines for me about reforging the crown and winning back Mistra's favor, and bye bye. Shadowheart didn't appear at all for me because I was in the 0.1% of people that didn't romance her, and now my biggest gripe. Karlach. For the entirety of the game, you are teased that her engine can be fixed. You collect those improved infernal plates, or whatever they are called. It is implied you can fix her, and you can do nothing with it. At one point, I thought maybe I missed something, but nope, she still either blows up or goes to hell with Will, which I thought was sweet of him, but narratively doesn't make much sense because Karlach said multiple times she would rather die than go back to Avernus. Then does the 180 because Will said so? Okay, it could be worse, but I'm still pissed that I rescued motherfucking Guardians who specialize in infernal creations and you can do fuck all with them. I think it was obvious that Karlach was the last addition to the cast, with even her voice actress commenting she didn't start recording lines until December of last year, I believe, and were the last to finish her work, and it definitely shows that her ending was incomplete and rushed, and it just makes me sad that there was no way to fix her infernal engine, and she ends up either dying or going back to the place she swore to never go back to. And yes, I know you can turn her into a mind flayer, but I still feel it's a bit unsatisfying. So that ties up both Will and Karlach, and let's see who do we have left. Wait a second, it's hard to remember because there are barely mention of anyone else at all. Minsk as always says something about Boo being the savior of the day, Granny Jaheira says good job buddy, and that's about it. You are the savior of Baldur's Gate. Whoop whoop hooray! Roll credits. Yes, I know that there is at least a cutscene with Shadowheart if you romanced her, and my boy Withers, or should I say Jergal, and his little snarky comments towards the end that we won't be seeing the Dead Free anymore, which thanks Kelemvor for that, because I was getting so exhausted of the ball plotline towards the end that I'm glad it's over, and I hope if there will ever be a DLC or even an expansion we will set sights on new horizons, perhaps going to the hells with Karlach and hopefully get some meaningful conclusion to the story. I know that not everything has to be served on a silver platter and not every subplot has to be mentioned at the end, that it's about the journey and not the destination and all that, but I just couldn't help but feel dissatisfied after the ending. Even some ending slides with narration would have been nice to see. I know there's a major patch in the works, but I doubt it will fix all the issues with Act 3 and the ending. Yet, I remain hopeful that over time Act 3 will be polished and a definitive edition is definitely not out of the question. As it stands though, it is what it is, and please don't take me for my opinion, Baldur's Gate 3 is still by far my game of the year based on the first 2 acts alone, and even the third one I couldn't put down for 5 days straight, despite its flaws, weird pacing, bugs, and lackluster ending with some illogical decisions. Looking at you, the Emperor. I think the last act suffers from lack of feedback and rushed release, and it rears its head on many occasions. Whether it was a conscious decision from Larian to release the game as it is to avoid Starfield and perhaps some other factors, I am still very hopeful, confident even, that the issues will be fixed with patches, and by no means am I bashing on the game as a whole. I admire how much passion and work was put into it, probably more than any game I can remember playing in the past decade. The lack of microtransactions and just being a pure, joyful, for the most part experience that just focuses on what we love the most, which is just pure gaming experience, was beyond welcomed. I slept for 2 hours for a week straight just so I could game more, and I absolutely don't regret my decision. But because of my passion towards gaming and what a love letter to all RPG fans the game is why I have some harsh critique when it comes to sticking to the landing. I had hoped Larian has learned after the roughness of arcs in Divinity Original Sin 2, but I am still confident that the game will be brought up on par and fixed most of its glaring issues, even the ending I'm sure will be addressed. So concluding, all I wanted to do was put my thoughts onto this video, and I hope we will have a healthy conversation about it, and I would love to hear your opinion about the final act of the game I will still hold dearly in my heart for the coming months, and I am already planning my future playthroughs. One of them will be an Evil Dark Urge playthrough on my Twitch channel, Twitch TV Kainra, so I hope to see you there and we will continue this conversation elsewhere. But of course, more videos to come on YouTube. Thank you very much for watching this one, thank you for your never-ending support, for all the comments, likes and subscriptions, and sorry for not making many videos lately. I do admit I got into Baldur's Gate 3 perhaps even a bit too much. So all of this is coming from a place of love, and I absolutely adore Baldur's Gate 3 still. And I'm putting my trust in Larian once again that the game will be a 10 out of 10 sooner rather than later, because all the issues I have I know can be ironed out over time. I personally think that the game would have benefited from this additional month of polish, but hey, at least we got to play the game earlier and it was still massively enjoyable. And I both don't regret and I am glad that I put so many hours into the game with many more to come. Again, thank you very much for watching my videos, let's have a healthy conversation in the comments and I'll see you again very soon.
Hell has its laws. effect and the cause. Curtain falls, but hold your applause. Squirm, squirm, for now down here come the claws.